We speak carelessly of freedom as though it were a pair of shears to cut every ribbon that resists our wishes. But a man who snaps every cord soon finds himself adrift, not liberated. Ships do not rejoice to be unmoored in a field. Birds are not emancipated by the sea. There is a place where each kind of life breathes best. I suggest that the human soul, too, has an element, an air proper to it, and that what we call ought is not a policeman's whistle but the wind that fills our sails. The strange discovery is this: to do whatever we like is often to be seized by whatever likes us least: habit, fashion, fear. True freedom is not the removal of limits, but the right ordering of loves, until the good becomes delightful and duty becomes desire. Not doing what we like, but liking what we ought, that is liberty's secret. We must begin, where all sane philosophy begins, with the recognition that man is a creature, not a self-caused brightness floating in a void. A violin string laid slack upon the table is free of tension, but it is also incapable of music. Stretch it rightly upon the pegs, tune it to a scale it did not invent, and it sings. So too our appetites and thoughts, when tightened to the pitch of reality, produce harmony. Left to themselves, they twang, complain, and finally fall silent in despair. The moral law is not an arbitrary tyranny laid upon us from without. It is the grammar of our being. To rebel against grammar is not to become original, but to become unintelligible. Consider the fish, who may tire of the old riverbank and dream of summer meadows. It may flop itself upon the grass in a bid for novelty, yet each gasp is not liberation, but suffocation. Nature, we say, and we are right. The creature thrives in that for which it was fashioned. There is a congruity between design and delight. Likewise, there is in us a congruity between righteousness and joy. The stern word ought is not the iron door of a dungeon, it is the latch of home. When we learn to like what we ought, we are not cowed, but completed. It follows that there are two kinds of liberty. The first is mere absence of interference, like removing the fences from a cliff. One feels very expansive for a moment, and then the ground gives way. The second, rarer liberty, is the capacity to do and to enjoy the good, what the ancients would have called virtue, the steady habit of the soul. The first kind makes rooms airless by tearing out their windows. The second opens the casement and admits the wind, though the window frame itself imposes a shape. Do not mistake the frame for a fetter. It is the very condition of seeing. Now, the dreadful truth is that men often do not like what they ought. To be told to prefer justice over self-advantage, chastity over appetite, humility over preening, feels at first like being told to prefer salt water to wine. But likes can be taught. The palate of the soul is educable. We are not condemned forever to childish tastes. We are invited to acquire an adult hunger for the bread of angels. That training, like all training, begins with obedience. No runner begins by loving the hill. He begins by surrendering to its slope. But if he perseveres, his lungs and legs awaken to pleasures unknown to the sedentary. The commandments are the soul's hills. Climb them, and your very breath becomes praise. There is an error abroad which says, "If I obey, I am a slave." But the heaviest shackles are forged by whim. A man who claims the right to indulge every impulse will soon discover that his impulses have claimed the right to indulge him. He will be ridden by what he thought he rode. Pride will curry him, fear will bridle him, fashion will spur him, and the inner ring, the subtle society of those whose approval we crave, will set the course. You may call that freedom if you like, but it is the freedom of a leaf in a storm. Better the liberty of an oak, rooted in the soil of truth, straining gladly under the honest wind. We must speak of love, for freedom is at bottom a matter of love. To like what we ought means that our affections have been reordered. Lesser things loved in a lesser way, greater things loved greatly, and God loved above all. This is no starvation diet of the heart. It is a banquet served in its proper courses. Disordered love turns good things into cruel masters, work into idolatry, pleasure into addiction, family into a jealous god. Ordered love returns them to their rightful place as gifts, not thrones. When the highest love is set highest, the other loves cease quarreling. The household of the heart becomes quiet and, in its quiet, free. Do not suppose, however, that this reordering is achieved by mere human will squaring its shoulders. The will is the steering wheel. It is not the engine. Grace is the engine. We must ask, seek, knock. Prayer is not the dreary recital of chores, but the opening of windows. The sacraments are not hoops to be jumped through, but doors to a country where, as we step, the very light changes. The Word of God is not a newspaper to be glanced at and discarded, but a letter from home. If we dwell in these rooms, we find that what was once duty begins to taste like delight. There is alchemy here. The gold is not our achievement, but His gift, and yet He does not give it without inviting our consent. Freedom is also social. Ships in a convoy must be seaworthy, yes, but they must also keep formation, and both assume a destination. So with morality, there is the personal integrity of the soul, the fairness of our dealings with others, and the ultimate purpose toward which the fleet sails. Omit anyone, and the voyage fails. A man who is sober and punctual, yet sails to the wrong port, is not free, but lost. A society that prizes choice while neglecting truth becomes a market of mirages. We are not delivered by multiplying options, but by knowing which option accords with reality. The broad road offers many lanes. The narrow path offers life. Suffering, too, has its curious ministry in freeing us from false freedoms. The man who has had a thorn removed praises the surgeon's needle. Pain can pry our fingers from trinkets we had mistaken for treasures. It can also reveal that obedience is not servility, but love under a weight, like a lover carrying a friend over a threshold. The cross is the world's great paradox. The freest man was the most obedient, and his obedience was the oxygen of his joy. If we follow, we shall sometimes bleed, but our wounds, rightly borne, will become windows. Permit me a word on habit. The soul is a garden whose hedges at first look restrictive, yet it is within the hedges that roses happen. Daily prayers, weekly worship, honest confession, small acts of generosity, the refusal to gossip, the deliberate keeping of promises, these are not chains but trellises. Vines without trellises sprawl and rot. Vines upon a frame climb into the sun. Do these things until you love them, and in loving them you will discover that you are not the sort of creature who must be bribed to do good, but the sort who rejoices to do it. That is freedom's mature fruit. What then is our aim? Not the exhausted liberty of doing as we please, but the serene and vigorous liberty of pleasing what is good. To stand in the light until our eyes prefer it. To listen to the music until our ears discern its rightness. To walk in the way until our feet find it home. This is not the shrinking of the self, but its enlargement. Not a cage, but a country. Not a subtraction, but a song. If we keep at it, by grace, with patience, we shall, in the end, be remade into those who like what they ought, because they behold the one who is altogether lovely. Freedom, as I have said, is not the unfastening of every tether, but the willing embrace of the right ones. If you would test this, observe a musician. The child at the piano, banging indiscriminately upon the keys, believes himself unshackled, yet all who hear know it is not music, but noise. Only when his fingers submit to the scales, only when his hands obey the rigors of practice, does freedom appear. The greater his obedience to the laws of harmony, the greater his liberty to create beauty. In this sense, freedom is not opposed to discipline. It is born of it. Without law, there is no art. Without obedience, no delight. So it is with the soul. The commandments of God are not bars across the cage. They are the score placed before us. The saints are not prisoners, but virtuosos. They have learned to play the melody of heaven upon the instrument of the heart, and their joy is the sound of true freedom. But here lies the difficulty. One cannot move from disorder to harmony in a single leap. The crooked back does not straighten overnight, nor the dislocated bone resuming its place without pain. Freedom requires conversion. It is the turning of the will, moment by moment, from the counterfeit to the real. And often that turning feels like loss. We think we are surrendering treasures, when in fact we are relinquishing toys. We imagine we are losing freedom, when we are merely losing the ability to self-destruct. The man who gives up drunkenness may feel bereft, until he discovers sobriety is not deprivation, but clarity. The woman who lays aside envy may feel empty, until she discovers gratitude is not blandness, but feast. The hollowing out is the prelude to filling. Do not mistake me. The world will mock this freedom. It will call slavery what is in fact liberty, and liberty what is in fact slavery. It will advertise that the man who throws off all restraint, who does what appetite demands, is the free one. But see him after a little while. See his body, wasted by indulgence. See his mind, restless and distracted. See his heart, endlessly needing novelty, yet never satisfied. He has not been liberated, but conscripted. He marches under a crueler master than law. He is a slave to himself, and the self is a tyrant. Freedom, therefore, is not solitary. It is always in relation to the highest good. A compass needle that spins wildly is not free, it is broken. A needle is free when it points north, because then it is being what it was made to be. So the human soul is free when it aligns with God. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Without that alignment, we are restless, turning endlessly, chasing horizons that recede. With it, we are at last still, and in that stillness, spacious. This brings me to the heart of the matter, the reformation of desire. Many of us imagine virtue to be the grim suppression of all our longings, but God is not interested in making us less hungry. He is interested in teaching us to hunger for what is real. A child may prefer sweetmeats to bread, but the parent insists upon nourishment. Heaven's work is to educate our appetite until we prefer bread to sugar, truth to illusion, love to lust, humility to vanity. And this re-education of desire is the deepest freedom. For when I at last love the good, I am no longer torn between what I ought to do and what I wish to do. The ought and the wish become one. It is a long road, yes, and not without stumbling. We will sometimes drag our feet. We will sometimes clutch at the trinkets of Egypt, though the promised land is ahead. But each time we repent, each time we turn back. Grace meets us, and grace is not a scolding teacher, but a patient father, lifting us again to our feet. By grace, the day will come when the commandments no longer seem alien but natural, when holiness feels less like an alien tongue and more like our mother's speech. Then obedience will not be effort, but instinct, not burden, but breath. And here is the paradox most glorious. When we are most surrendered, we are most free. For to surrender to God is to lay down the false sovereignty that was enslaving us, and to awaken to a kingdom without walls. My yoke is easy, says Christ, and my burden light. He alone can speak of a yoke that liberates, a burden that releases. To wear his yoke is to walk upright, to breathe deeply, to laugh without fear. In him, we discover that freedom is not an escape from love's claim, but its fulfillment. My friends, we long for freedom because we long for him. Every counterfeit liberty, every restless chase after choice, is but a shadow of that deeper longing. True freedom is nothing less than union with the source of all goodness, the author of all joy. And until we yield to him, we shall remain forever free only in name. When we speak of freedom, we must always remember its end. For freedom is not merely the opening of a gate, it is the setting of a journey. To be freed from prison is only half the story. The real question is, freed for what? A man may be released from his cell, yet wander into the desert and perish. Release without direction is no blessing but a curse. True freedom has an orientation. It is ordered toward a goal. And for us, that goal is likeness to Christ. To become, by grace, sons and daughters who reflect the image of the Son. That is the country to which liberty points, and apart from it, freedom is a compass with no north. The Scriptures speak of freedom as service. You were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. Here lies the paradox again. Freedom is perfected in service. The self-centered life, grasping for its own rights, is in chains. But the life that gives itself away, that delights in obedience to God and in charity toward neighbor, is enlarged, spacious, radiant. We think of heaven as an infinite kingdom, and rightly so. But heaven begins to glimmer even here, wherever a soul learns to prefer love to pride. Observe how this truth is inscribed into creation. The river is free not when it disperses aimlessly over the land, but when it follows its banks to the sea. The bird is free not when it tumbles from the sky, but when its wings beat upon the wind. So the soul is free not when it disregards all rule, but when it flows into its appointed course, when it lifts itself upon the currents of grace. Disorder may look like liberty. In reality, it is collapse. Only in harmony is there true expansion. We might imagine, then, that freedom is the gift of God's truth, shaping us not as clay bound to a mold, but as seed called to bloom. A seed that rots in the hand and never takes root, is free from soil, yet sterile. Planted deep, it surrenders, and in surrender discovers the liberty of growth, the liberty of becoming what it was meant to be. Freedom, for the Christian, is precisely this flowering. It is the soul opening under the rain of grace, the heart expanding in the sunlight of God. And let us not forget that this freedom is not fragile, not easily stolen by circumstance. The martyrs bore chains, yet were free. The Apostle Paul wrote from prison, yet sang. Christ himself submitted to the nails, yet remained the freest man who ever lived. The world may strip us of property, of power, even of breath, but it cannot touch the liberty that springs from loving the good. That liberty is immortal, for it rests upon the eternal. The devil's great deception, by contrast, is to equate freedom with indulgence. He whispers that we are only free when we cast off all ought and run after every appetite. Yet every sin is a promise that breaks itself. Lust offers ecstasy and delivers emptiness. Greed promises plenty and breeds hunger. Pride promises glory and yields isolation. One by one, the false freedoms unmask themselves as prisons. Only in God do the promises hold. His yoke alone is easy, his burden alone light. His commandment alone, when obeyed, becomes joy. Therefore, beloved, do not fear the word ought. It is not the growl of a taskmaster, but the invitation of a father. When he says, love your enemy, he is not burdening you, but beckoning you into a greater liberty, the liberty of forgiveness that loosens the chains of bitterness. When he says, be holy as I am holy, he is not demanding the impossible, but offering you his very likeness, his own life transfigured within you. To obey is to step into the sunlight, to breathe the air of heaven. To disobey is to hold your breath in the dark. Freedom, then, is not achieved by rebellion, but by surrender. Not by self-assertion, but by self-giving. Not by doing what we like, but by learning, slowly, patiently, joyfully, to like what we ought. And in that learning, we shall discover that the ought is not foreign, but our truest home. For we were made for God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in Him. If freedom is found in loving what we ought, then its perfection lies in love Himself. For God is love, and to know Him is to be unshackled from every lesser bondage. Think of it, when a man loves, truly loves, he does not experience his devotion as a chain. The mother who wakes at midnight to soothe her child does not calculate whether her liberty is infringed. The soldier who shields his comrade does not stop to ask whether he is free in that instant. Love transforms duty into delight, and what would otherwise be endured as a weight becomes embraced as a joy. Herein lies the secret of heaven. It is a country where every heart has been trained, healed, really, so fully that its only desire is for the good. To live there is to be incapable of envy, incapable of deceit, incapable of cruelty, not because the gates forbid it, but because the soul no longer wants it. But here, in the Shadowlands, our affections are wayward. We love too little or too much, in the wrong order or for the wrong reasons. And this distortion of desire makes obedience feel foreign. The commandments strike us as alien rules, imposed from without. Yet the more we walk in them, the more we find they are not chains but cures. They do not stifle our humanity. They restore it. Holiness is not the denial of the self, but the unveiling of the true self, the self set free to reflect its maker. We are tempted to imagine freedom as a wide plain, stretching without boundary. Yet freedom is more like a mountain path, narrow but ascending, difficult but leading ever upward into air more pure. At first, the climb seems exhausting, every step a strain. But as we rise, our lungs strengthen, our sight clears, and behind us lies the smoke of the valleys where we once mistook shadows for substance. At the summit, when at last the clouds part, we find that what was arduous has become joy, and the path that seemed narrow has opened into immensity. This is why the saints, whose lives may appear from afar as cramped by rules and restrictions, shine with an expansiveness unknown to the worldly. They seem to have laid aside much, but in truth they have gained all. They have learned the paradox. To die to self is to live unto God. To surrender is to conquer. To serve is to reign. In their company we perceive that freedom is not the absence of law, but the presence of love. Not the loosening of every tie, but the weaving of a stronger bond with Him who is life. And so, my dear friends, do not settle for the counterfeit liberties that the world offers you. Liberties that end in ashes. Do not be deceived into believing that to do whatever you like is to be free. That path is wide, but it is a funnel that narrows into death. Choose instead the liberty of Christ, which may begin as a narrow gate, but opens into eternity. Yield your will to His, and you will discover your will reborn. Offer Him your loves, and you will find them purified, intensified, made more real. For the end of all freedom is not self-expression, but communion. Not to stand alone in splendid isolation, but to kneel together before the throne. And in that kneeling, to rise higher than we ever dreamed. One might ask, why, if this freedom is so glorious, does it feel so costly at the beginning? Why does the soul, yearning for liberation, recoil when the road is revealed? The answer is simple and tragic. Our tastes have been corrupted. Like a man long imprisoned in a damp cave, we have grown used to stale air and call it fresh. To step into sunlight burns our eyes. To breathe the open air makes us cough, but it is only a passing sickness. Endure it, and the lungs learn their true work. The eyes adjust, and the light, once painful, becomes beloved. Conversion is nothing other than this adjustment of our loves, the painful, glorious healing of our affections. True freedom requires this healing, for without it we mistake our chains for ornaments. The miser cherishes his coins as though they were wings, yet they are anchors. The adulterer calls his appetite passion, though it leaves him emptier with each indulgence. The proud man declares himself self-made, though his self is the narrowest prison of all. Grace does not merely break these chains, it teaches us to see them for what they are. For what tyrant is so terrible as the one we embrace? What dungeon so inescapable as the one we decorate? Christ enters that dungeon not only to open the door, but to awaken our desire to walk through it. Freedom, then, is inseparable from truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. A lie, however flattering, enslaves. A truth, however stern, liberates. To know that I am a creature is to be free from the delusion that I am a god. To know that my neighbor is an image of God is to be free from the impulse to use him as a tool. To know that Christ reigns is to be free from despair when earthly thrones totter. Truth does not shrink liberty, it expands it. For a map is not a limitation of the traveler, but his deliverance from aimless wandering. And yet, even the best maps cannot compel the heart. For freedom is not only external, but internal. A man may be surrounded by truth, taught the commandments, shown the path, and yet remain in bondage if his desires cling to the shadows. Only love can complete what law begins. That is why God does not leave us with instructions alone. He gives himself. The incarnation is the grand invasion of love into the prison of our false freedoms. Christ does not merely point to the way, he walks it and, in walking, transforms it. To follow him is not to trudge behind a stern taskmaster, but to walk with a friend whose very presence changes our hearts. At Calvary, the mystery is made plain. The freest man who ever lived, the one who always loved what he ought, placed himself under nails and thorns. Outwardly, no one ever seemed less free. Yet in that surrender, he enacted the deepest liberty, the liberty of perfect love, stronger than fear, stronger than death. From his cross flows the only freedom worth having, the freedom to give oneself wholly to the Father, and in that giving to receive life unending. And so, beloved, if you would know freedom, do not look to the indulgent man who does all he wishes. Look to the crucified man who did all that was needful. There is the pattern, there the secret, there the country in which we shall one day breathe without hindrance. To love what we ought is not drudgery, but destiny. It is the song for which the universe was tuned, the dance for which our souls were fashioned, the home for which our long exile has made us ache. The destiny of freedom is not some abstract ideal, but a person, for in the end, freedom is not a thing we possess, but a life we participate in, the very life of Christ. When we speak of liking what we ought, we mean in truth learning to delight in what delights him. Imagine a choir, each voice fumbling at first, some flat, some sharp. Yet when the conductor lifts his hand, the parts align, the harmony emerges. So with our wills. Left to ourselves, we produce discord. Yielded to him, we begin to sing in tune with the eternal musician. And that harmony, once tasted, is sweeter than all the jangling freedoms of self-will. Here we glimpse the grandeur of heaven. It is not a realm where we are merely permitted to do as we please, but a realm where what pleases us has at last been made pure. There the saints are not robots, stripped of choice, but lovers whose every choice is joy, because their loves have been healed. They are free because they cannot sin, and they cannot sin because they are truly free. It is a liberty deeper than mere alternatives. It is the consummation of desire itself. Consider the contrast. Hell, we might say, is the place where everyone insists upon doing what he likes, and thus each soul becomes locked within itself, a solitary despot of a collapsing kingdom. Heaven is the opposite. Each soul, in learning to love what it ought, finds not confinement but communion. For love enlarges. To love God is to love all whom he loves, and thus to be forever expanding, forever enriched. Freedom in heaven is infinite expansion, not into chaos, but into fellowship. The river of the self flows into the ocean of God, and yet is not lost, but fulfilled. Do not suppose, however, that this destiny removes all struggle here below. Freedom, while promised, must be practiced. Every day we are presented with choices that shape our affections. Each act of obedience, however small, is a training of the palate. Each refusal of sin, however hidden, is a strengthening of the will. Slowly, steadily, the soul learns to prefer light to darkness, truth to lies, eternity to the glitter of the moment. The Spirit is the patient tutor, and the lessons are sometimes stern, but they are lessons in joy. For God is not content to leave us half-healed. He would have us radiant. And what of fear? Many think that surrender to God means the loss of identity. Yet the opposite is true. When we cling to ourselves, we shrink. When we give ourselves, we grow. The acorn that refuses to split will never be more than a seed. Only by yielding to the soil does it become an oak. So too the soul. By dying to self, it comes alive to God. Far from being diminished, it becomes most fully itself, precisely because it has ceased to orbit its own gravity and has entered the great dance of love. Freedom, then, is not an end in itself, but a road. And that road, if faithfully walked, does not fade into the wilderness, but rises into glory. The saints beckon us forward. Christ himself waits at the summit. And when at last we stand in his presence, we shall discover that freedom was not about escape, but about arrival, not about casting off, but about coming home. Freedom, as I have sought to show, is not the permission to wander aimlessly, but the power to walk rightly. It is not the liberty of the orphan cast into the street, but the liberty of the child welcomed at last into the Father's house. For the Christian, every command of God is not a chain, but a key. Unlocking rooms of joy we had forgotten were ours. To obey is to be restored. To surrender is to be exalted. To love what we ought is to become, at last, what we truly are. Think of the weary pilgrim who has trudged long miles in the dust, convinced that every turning is but another demand. Yet at the crest of the hill, he sees the lights of home flickering in the valley below. The road he thought burdensome was the very path of return. So it will be with us. We shall look back upon our obedience and see that what seemed restraint was guidance, what seemed loss was gain, what seemed silence was music we could not yet hear. True freedom is, therefore, not fragile, not circumstantial, not the plaything of moods or markets. It is anchored in the eternal. The man who has learned to like what he ought cannot be robbed of his liberty, for it is lodged in his very heart. Though storms rage, though powers threaten, though even death itself approaches, he is free. Free because he belongs to the one who conquered the grave. This is why Christ is our freedom. He is not only the example of liberty, he is liberty itself. In him, duty and delight meet and kiss. In him, obedience is joy and surrender is victory. In him, the soul that has long been enslaved to itself finds release. And it is only in him that we discover the paradox fulfilled, not doing what we like, but liking what we ought. For what we ought, loving God and neighbor, is in the end the very thing for which we were created. Let us then not be deceived by the false freedoms that parade through the world. Let us not be enticed by the hollow promise of doing whatever pleases us, for that road ends in weariness and want. Instead, let us set our faces toward the freedom that endures, the freedom that enlarges, the freedom that is nothing less than union with the God who is love. There, and only there, will our restless hearts be at peace. And so, dear friends, if these reflections have stirred something within you, if you too hunger for the freedom that does not fade, I invite you to walk this path with me. Let us learn together to love what we ought, until one day we awaken in that country where every ought has become joy, and every joy has become eternal. If this message has touched your heart, I encourage you to like this video, share it with those you love, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more reflections such as these. May God bless you, and may He lead you ever deeper into the freedom of truth and love.